My name is Jeff Bost, and today we're going to talk about recognizing and preventing burnout in the workplace. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Joseph Maroon. Dr. Maroon is a renowned neurosurgeon, concussion, sports medicine expert, as well as a triathlete. Dr. Maroon has recently written a book called Square One, A Simple Guide to a Balanced Life. And with that background, Dr. Maroon, I'm going to ask you a few questions. Is it possible to balance our work life and our home life? Is it really achievable?
That's an excellent question, Jeff. You know, some people would say it's an oxymoron to have a balanced life in terms of your work and your family and your social situation. And the ironic thing is society applauds imbalance. We're rewarded for being self-sacrificing and giving up our family and giving up the things that we like. The problem with that is there are catastrophic consequences that occur if you're not somewhat in balance in your life. And it's something I'd really like to talk to you about more.
I know one of the things we've seen with our millennials, the younger generation, is that they're complaining or saying that there's an imbalance to our life-work situation. What is your feelings on the millennials in that situation?
Well, Jeff, you know, it's very clear. Many surveys have shown that to millennials, the most important thing in a job situation is work-life balance. And to somehow come to grips with the stresses of a job and with the interpersonal relationships of a job, to be able to have more time for family, for kids, for vacation, for time off. In my generation, and to some extent your generation, the work ethic was a little bit different. The self-sacrificing aspect of it was sometimes all-consuming, as it was for me at one time in my life. But I think we know that with millennials, with a work-life balance, you can become more efficient, you become more tolerant of problems with people and the workplace, and you become better employees.
Dr. Maroon, you've just mentioned the word burnout. What are some of the signs associated with burnout that you've seen?
Well, unquestionably, in physicians in particular, there's a 50% burnout rate, and it's said to be 30 to 50% in the general population. What does that mean? Burnout relates to physical and or emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, depression. You can become cynical, act out your feelings and your anger more often, and there's frequently a low sense of self-accomplishment in the workplace. You know, why am I doing this? I'm not accomplishing much. And these kinds of thoughts, where you become cynical, angry, depressed, are all signs of burnout that really must be dealt with early on before it can really lead to acting out behavior that can be very detrimental to the individual as well as the company, and can lead to catastrophic complications and problems.
Dr. Maroon, you mentioned about stress in physicians and the idea of burnout. I can't think of any other more stressful occupation than being a neurosurgeon. Can you tell us the story about your burnout and how that affected you?
Sure, Jeff. When I finished my residency training and I came actually to the University of Pittsburgh to be on the staff, I was very fortunate to have wonderful colleagues and advanced rather rapidly through the ranks of professionalism, assistant, clinical, full professor. And I thought I had it all. I was married, I had 2 children, and one day my father passed away suddenly of a heart attack at age 60, and my family broke up. My wife left the city with the kids, and I was so depressed that I couldn't function as a neurosurgeon anymore, and I ended up moving in to a lonely, dark farmhouse in Wheeling, West Virginia, Dallas Pike, West Virginia, with my mother. My father left a rundown truck stop, heavily in debt to my mother. So I ended up 1 week doing brain surgery. The next week, I literally was filling up 18-wheelers and flipping hamburgers in a truck stop. So I went from as the high to the low as you can get. And I was in this state of depression for quite a few months.
Dr. Maroon, how did the stress affect you during that time? You were saying that you were in depression. What were other signs of stress that you were undergoing during that time?
And I think that's a very important question, Jeff, because what does stress do to the body? When you're under stress, in a chronic situation in particular, it elevates the cortisol level of the body. And elevated cortisol is good if you're in the jungle and you're being chased by a lion and it's fight or flight, and it gets your muscles and your heart and your blood pressure up to save yourself. However, when it's chronic, several bad things happen. Number one, the cortisol literally destroys cells in the brain, particularly in that part of the brain called the hippocampus, which subserves memory. So when people who are under severe or chronic stress, you lose your memory. And also, when I was living in that farmhouse, I contracted infectious hepatitis from the truck stop food. Why? Because my immunity was markedly suppressed, which is another thing that occurs with depression. I had insomnia, and I simply was unable to work. I had no energy, I was fatigued, I was tired. So chronic stress can have very damaging effects on the body.
I'm sure people can relate, perhaps not to that degree, about having stress, especially with the workplace and burnout you've talked about. You were pretty much down and out at that time. How did you're a successful neurosurgeon today. How did you come out of that dark hole and reinvigorate yourself?
Well, that's the critical question, Jeff. How does one regain balance after a cataclysmic fall? And at that time, I picked up a little book entitled I Dare You that was circulated when I graduated from high school to high school kids throughout the country by William Danforth, who was the CEO and founder of the Ralston Purina Checkerboard Square Company. And the title of the book was I Dare You. And basically, he dared the reader to lead a balanced life. And he said, the first thing I want you to do is draw a square. And on the top of the square, put work. On this side, family, social. On this side, spiritual. And on this side, physical. And I want you to draw a line consistent with how much effort you put on each one of these in a typical day. And when I sat down, my line was literally flat. There was no family, there was no spirituality, and there was no physical. It was like a flatline EKG. And I really was mentally and almost physically deceased. So that at about the same time, a very, very serendipitous, good thing happened. The banker who held the mortgage on the truck stop called me and said, "Hey, Joe, let's go for a run." I said, "Run? I can't even walk." I think he wanted to see if I was going to be alive long enough to pay off the mortgage on the truck stop. But regardless, I ended up making it down to the local high school track in Wheeling and went around 4 times. Thought I'd die. I said, never again. But that night, I had a revelation. It was the first night I slept in about 3 months. So I went down the next day and did 1.25 miles, and then 1.5 miles, and pretty soon I was up to 4, 5, 6, 7 miles. And several good things started to happen. I started to lose weight without dieting, unintentionally. I improved my diet, and my depression started to lift. I started to think again. I could sleep, and with good food, good diet, exercise, stress control, I actually was fulfilling exactly what William Danforth wanted us to do in the square. Right. I rebalanced the family side, the spiritual side came back, and I rediscovered the importance of prayer and meditation and spirituality. And the physical side completely rearranged my neurotransmitters and my cardiovascular system. And I was able, after a year, to get back to the university, assume my position, and since then, it's really been the most fun and challenging part of my life.
Dr. Maroon, in your book, Square One, you sort of describe that in a little more detail as far as the different pillars, I believe you refer to them as, the spirituality, the family, the work, the social, as far as how you got back. One of the big things you talked about just now was physicalities. What were the benefits of being physically active that you noted or do note that happened to the brain?
Well, Jeff, one of the most important things I discovered was the best antidepressant available to anyone. And it's not the SSRIs or the pills that you usually get from your doctor. The most effective antidepressant is aerobic physical activity. Even if it's just walking 5,000 to 10,000 steps a day, if it's done consistently, it does several things to the brain. Number one, it increases dopamine, the feel-good hormone. Number two, it increases serotonin, which the drugs that people take are taken for that reason. So you do this without the complications of fatigue, decreased libido, complications from drugs. And it also increases and improves mood dramatically. So, plus it mitigates osteoporosis, it improves your cardiovascular system, your muscles, your tendons. So it's so huge and so important, and it's the last thing anybody depressed or burned out wants to do.
Right.
It's the last thing you want to do, but there's a cognitive aspect to it. If you really know and believe that it's going to help you, it's worth doing, and you should do it.
Dr. Maroon, one of the best parts of your book, I thought, was your ability to say how your food, your exercise, your spirituality, your decreasing stress actually affects the body. I think it's a mystery to a lot of people. You learn to eat well, it's healthy for you, you learn to get enough sleep, but what's the actual mechanisms that are going on that people can really latch on to?
An excellent question, Jeff, and I have to invoke a whole new science that has been recognized in the last 10 to 20 years called epigenetics. Epigenetics refers to that science or that part of genetics above the genes. If we envision our genes as a blueprint that's put out on a table that has the code for building a house, nothing happens to that unless that blueprint is acted upon. So what are the factors that act upon our genes for better or for worse? And there are four. Number one is nutrition and supplements. Number two is physical exercise. Number three is environmental factors: alcohol, smoking, water, glyphosate, pesticides. Number four, extremely important, is the control of stress. So what happens when you eat a Big Mac and with an order of fries, a bottle of soda with phosphoric acid and sugar? It tells your genes to make inflammatory agents which are the underlying cause of Alzheimer's disease, cardiovascular disease, arthritis, stroke. If you eat a Mediterranean type diet, fish, lean meat, avocados, nuts, salads, fruits, it tells your genes to make anti-inflammatory agents which reduce the inflammation in your blood vessels of your heart, your brain, and your joints. So it's incredibly important to invoke and use an anti-inflammatory diet, as I just stated. Number two, in terms of an epigenetic factor, is exercise. When you walk, as I said, 30 to 45 minutes a day, you don't have to do triathlons, but you do several things. I mentioned the neurotransmitters, in particular, a compound called BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, is released in the brain, which does three things. It actually creates new brain cells. It increases the synapticity between the connections between the cells, and then it enhances what's called neuroplasticity, the ability to take huge amounts of information and focus it like a laser beam and use it functionally. So that's huge, so that if you are stressed and depressed and chronically, literally destroying some of the brain cells, physical activity, regular, can create new brain cells and new connections and greatly facilitate brain function. And then environmental factors, of course, smoking is a horrible disease that kills so many people. Excessive alcohol intake is horrible. And then we know epigenetically, environmental factors affect the fetus in the woman, in that a woman who does heroin or even smokes marijuana during pregnancy has a much more likelihood of that affecting the developing brain of the infant, and may be related to dependence coming out of the womb, set the child up for addiction later on, and even autistic problems. So huge environmental factors relative to genetics in the womb, and then stress. The most deleterious thing to our body and brain is unmitigated stress. So prayer, meditation, in conjunction with the other factors, have been used for thousands of years by our ancestors to control stress. And a strong family unit is a critical thing to controlling stress. And with the family breakdown now that we see in our country, and we see the problems that occur from that in children, and it really needs to be rectified in a big way.
I think one of the biggest things I took from what you just said is that we have some control. The idea that stress, the things that happen in our lives, are controllable to some degree through the factors that you mentioned and epigenetics. So the idea that in your Square One book, A Simple Guide to a Balanced Life, I think you pulled it all together. I certainly recommend those of you who are able to read that book in the sense that Dr. Maroon does lay out a very simple guide with the square to balance your life, and it can help with stress. I know it helped me. I'd like to thank you very much, Dr. Maroon. Is there any summary words you'd like to say before we stop?
Yes, there are, Jeff. And let me put it all together. I think there's a term called homeostasis, which means the mechanisms physiologically by which our bodies stay in balance. Our kidneys, our heart, without thinking, maintain a homeostatic situation. The balance that we need to attain to function at the highest level is really within our choice, how we choose to eat, whether or not we choose to exercise, our environmental factors, how much we drink, don't drink, smoke, don't smoke, and also how we control stress. All of these epigenetic factors are within our choice. These are all choices we make on a daily basis. So the problem that I had was that I had no insight into my work habit, how totally absorbed and committed I was to 24/7 work. I neglected the family, I neglected exercise, my body, and clearly I neglected my faith and spirituality. You have to have insight into those things on a daily basis in order to rectify them. So I would say to be mindful, to be aware, to be attuned to your body and your mind is the key factor.
Thank you, Dr. Maroon, for those insights, and we very much appreciate you being here with us today.